In the grand timeline of empires, historians mark their fall with the sacking of cities or the death of kings. The fall of Rome is the conquest of Constantine. The fall of the British Empire is the independence of India. These are clear, unmistakable moments of defeat. But the American empire will not be recorded this way. Its fall is not being marked by a military defeat, but by a financial one. It is a quiet, invisible collapse happening in the plumbing of the global economy, far from the eyes of the public. In 1971, the United States abandoned the gold standard and created an empire of paper, an empire built not on military conquest, but on a single, brutally effective economic weapon, the petrodollar. For 50 years, this system has been the bedrock of American global dominance, forcing every nation on earth to participate in funding its economy, its government, and its wars. But in the last few years, that system has been systematically and secretly dismantled. The empire has been bled dry, and its funeral has already been held. There was no announcement, no public mourning. It was a secret ceremony, attended only by America's greatest rivals. And now that the burial is complete, the consequences, the great reckoning for 50 years of privilege, are about to begin for every single American. This is the story of how the BRICS nations quietly engineered the death of the petrodollar, why they did it, and what the post-American financial world will look like. Part 1. The Empire of Obligation. To understand the death of this system, you must first understand the sheer brilliance of its design. It was a machine built to create a state of permanent global dependency. After President Nixon severed the dollar's final link to gold in 1971, the dollar was technically worthless. It was backed by nothing but a promise from a government about to enter a decade of stagflation and national decline. To prevent a global stampede away from the dollar, the Nixon administration engineered the most significant geopolitical deal of the 20th century. The deal was forged with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was simple. The U.S. would provide the Saudi monarchy with absolute, unconditional military protection. All of its advanced weaponry, its intelligence, and the might of its naval fleets were now at the kingdom's disposal. In return, the Saudis would do one thing. They would agree to sell their oil, every single barrel, exclusively for U.S. dollars. And because the Saudis were the swing producer, they soon forced all of OPEC to follow suit. Overnight, the U.S. dollar was no longer backed by gold, it was backed by oil. This masterstroke created a global trap. Any nation that wanted to power its economy, to run its factories, heat its homes, or move its armies, first had to acquire U.S. dollars. This generated a massive, permanent, and artificial demand for America's currency from every corner of the globe. It was an empire of obligation. Japan, Germany, China, Brazil, they all had to build up enormous reserves of U.S. dollars just to function. These reserves were then lent back to the United States government at low interest rates in the form of treasury bonds. In essence, the entire world was not only forced to buy America's primary export, the dollar, but they were also forced to fund America's ballooning government deficits. This system allowed the United States to defy the laws of economics for half a century. It could run massive trade deficits, importing real goods from the world while sending back paper and digital currency. It could create out of thin air. It could fund the largest military in history without ever having to raise taxes to a level that would bankrupt its own citizens. The petrodollar was the ultimate asymmetric weapon, and for 50 years, any nation that dared to challenge it met a swift end. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraq would begin selling its oil for euros. 3 years later, Baghdad was occupied. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi proposed a gold-backed African dinar to sell oil. 2 years later, he was dead, and Libya was a failed state. The message was clear. The petrodollar was the empire's power source, and all threats would be eliminated, until the threats became too big to eliminate. Part 2. The coordinated demolition. The death of the petrodollar was not an accident of history. It was a planned, coordinated demolition, executed by a coalition of nations who realized the empire had become a threat to their very existence. The architects were, of course, the BRICS nations. Their motivation was not ideology, but cold, calculated self-preservation. The critical turning point was February 2022. When the United States and its allies responded to the conflict in Ukraine by sanctioning Russia, the U.S. central bank, and freezing nearly $300 billion of its foreign currency reserves, they crossed a line. They demonstrated to the entire world that the rules of the game no longer existed. Private property, national sovereignty, these concepts were now meaningless. If you defied the empire, your nation's savings could be confiscated overnight. For China, India, Brazil, and even longtime ally Saudi Arabia, this was an existential threat. They understood that the dollar was no longer just a currency. It was a leash, and they began to cut it faster and more aggressively than anyone in Washington thought possible. The demolition occurred in 3 distinct stages. Stage 1, the bilateral escape routes. The first step was to prove that large-scale trade could exist entirely outside the dollar system. Russia and China took the lead. They began settling all of their multi-billion-dollar energy trades in Russian rubles and Chinese yuan. India followed, setting up a system to buy Russian oil in Indian rupees. This was the first crack in the dam. Major world powers were now trading the most strategic commodity on Earth without ever touching a US dollar. Stage 2, the defection of the core. The second and most devastating stage was the betrayal from within the system itself. For years, the US-Saudi relationship had been fraying. In 2023, the unthinkable became official. Saudi Arabia's finance minister announced publicly that the kingdom was now open to selling oil and gas in currencies other than the dollar. Shortly after, Saudi Arabia was formally invited to join the BRICS alliance. This was the moment the empire truly broke. The anchor of the entire petrodollar system had just defected to the enemy. Without the exclusivity of Saudi oil, the dollar's privileged status was gone. Stage 3, building the new system. The final stage was not just to abandon the old system, but to build a new one. The BRICS nations have been quietly constructing the infrastructure for a post-dollar world. This includes the BRICS payment system, a direct rival to the American-controlled SWIFT network, which allows nations to transact directly without fear of being cut off by U.S. sanctions. More importantly, they have begun to lay the groundwork for a new reserve currency, potentially backed by a basket of commodities like gold, oil, and grain. This is not merely a replacement for the dollar. It is a fundamental challenge to the very idea of a single nation controlling the world's financial system. These were not random events. This was the financial equivalent of a multi-front war executed with precision while the American empire was consumed by internal division, political chaos, and a profound misunderstanding of the global shift that was happening. Part 3. The Great Reckoning. So the funeral is over. The system is dead. What happens when the world no longer needs the US dollar in the same way? The consequences will be a form of reverse gravity. For 50 years, the United States has been exporting its inflation to the rest of the world. Trillions upon trillions of dollars have been held overseas by foreign nations to facilitate trade and store value. But now, the logic has flipped. As Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and India begin to trade in their own currencies, their need to hold vast reserves of US dollars will evaporate. What do you do with an asset you no longer need? You sell it. This process has already begun. Central banks across the world are now divesting from U.S. Treasury bonds at the fastest rate in history. These are the dollars that are now beginning to flood back home. This isn't just a financial event. It is a tidal wave of stored economic energy, built up over decades, now being unleashed directly onto the domestic U.S. economy. The result will be a structural, permanent inflation far beyond anything Americans have experienced in their lifetimes. The cost of everything the nation imports, from the phones in our pockets to the cars we drive to the food on our tables, will rise relentlessly. The purchasing power of the average American will enter a death spiral. Simultaneously, the U.S. government will face a catastrophic funding crisis, who will now buy the trillions in debt it issues every year to fund its military and social programs. If the captive buyers of the petrodollar system are gone, the only buyer left will be the Federal Reserve itself, forced to print money on an unimaginable scale, not to stimulate the economy, but simply to keep the government from defaulting. This is the final stage of every failed empire's currency, hyperinflation. The fall of the American empire will not be televised. It will be experienced. It will be felt at every gas pump, in every grocery store, and in every household budget. The 50-year privilege is over. The funeral has concluded. The bill is now due.